another ship around. Now, I mentioned this was done by the Policy Exchange. David Spencer is a former DCI, Detective Chief Inspector in the Met, and now Head of Crime and Justice at the Policy Exchange, joins me now. Thanks for coming on board, sir. How significant is it then that we have Assistant Commissioner such as Matt Twist making these comments to your colleagues? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, I think it is significant, but I also would agree with your earlier comment about Assistant Commissioner Twist's remarks. He's a very senior public servant, and the fact that he's been willing to say publicly and go on the record that they didn't get everything right is absolutely to his credit. And frankly, if we had more people in public service who are willing to do so, then we might be in a better position. So I completely agree with you. It is a significant finding. And within the report, we also published some polling today where we asked people how they would react to a major protest going on in their town or city, whether that's London or elsewhere. And a substantial majority of people said they would drop plans to do those visits if there was a major protest going on. And actually what we particularly found was that was particularly the case for women and for older people. So it is very clear that these protests are having an impact on what the ordinary member of the public is willing to do. And also the public overwhelmingly support police intervention in disruptive protests. So the numbers here are staggering. So 84% said that the police should intervene if protesters are shouting and being intimidating, 84% if they're damaging property, 80% if protesters are holding banners that contain racist or derogatory slogans, 79% when protesters are deliberately obstructing the road or public transport or workplaces. So it is very clear to us from this work that the current legal regime and, in fact, the way, unfortunately, the police have dealt with some aspects of the protests are at significant odds with the mood of the public.
OK. In specific detail, what do you believe the Met should have done that they didn't do?
Well, I think there's very clearly one example there about that Assistant Commissioner Twist talks about in relation to the people calling jihad. And first of all, I fully recognise, and we at Policy Exchange fully recognise just how difficult these situations are to police. It is not easy, and we absolutely recognise that. But certainly in some of these cases, there should certainly have been earlier intervention and arrests made at the time. And my hope is that they will learn from that experience, and they will do so in the future.
Stay on the line if you would, Mr. Spencer. I want to bring into the conversation Shami Chakrabarti, who's a Labour peer, was Shadow Attorney General, and of course served with distinction as the Director of Liberty. Where would you stand on the idea of early arrest, perhaps more robust policing, if I may use that word, Shami? Good morning.
Good morning to you. First of all, I just want to say that peaceful protest is an important safety valve in a democracy, as opposed to planned violent disorder of the kind we saw, the racist targeted thuggery over the summer. That is not a safety valve. That is a threat to democracy. And one of my concerns about this report from the right-wing think tank Policy Exchange is that at times it attempts to equate the two. It puts predominantly pro-ceasefire, pro-Palestine protests on the one hand in the same context at times with what we saw over the summer. And I think that is political, ideological and a mistake that most members of the public would see as a mistake.
Well, let's put... sorry, Shami, go ahead. Let you finish your sentence. Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
In terms of specific examples, I think Matt Twist is to be commended for saying we didn't get everything right, particularly in the early days, but this has been spun, particularly in the Policy Exchange press release, to suggest that they got tons of things wrong, and I don't see that on the evidence. Most of these so-called research in this document, which I've read this morning, is opinion polls, which are unsurprising. Of course, the public change their plans when there's a big demonstration, just as they do when there's a big sporting event. Of course, if it's not your protest, it's annoying. But when it is your protest, whether for taxi drivers' rights or farmers' rights, then you care passionately about the right to dissent.
All right, David Spencer, bring you back in. It's a necessary safety valve, and you have, in part, almost put together the demonstrations that were, in most part, peaceful with the racist demos we saw, the so-called summer riots. David Spencer.
Well, I think there are three things here that I would point out. The first thing is I unequivocally reject the idea that we have equated what happened during the summer with protests. I completely reject that, and we are very clear throughout the report that we do not do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Baroness Chakrabarti suggested that it was essentially all opinion or opinion polls. This report is supported by former Home Office ministers, former Ministry of Justice ministers, Labour and Conservative, and a former Met Police Commissioner. The legal analysis, which runs to something like, I don't have it in front of me, but something like 70 pages of detailed legal analysis, was conducted by a former First Parliamentary Counsel, Sir Stephen Laws. So I would reject completely those assertions by Baroness Chakrabarti. And finally, the idea that many of the protests that she's referring to are peaceful is simply nonsense. There were, certainly in the first 6 months, 400 people arrested, including 15 for terrorism offences. There were instances of violence. There were regularly scenes of anti-Semitic chants. When we look at other protests, so in particularly Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, they've been regularly arrested for criminal damage. The idea that we are talking about entirely peaceful protest is simply nonsense.
Let's put that to Baroness Chakrabarti. Shami?
Obviously not entirely peaceful, but when you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people gathering week on week, and Mr. Spencer can point to only 400 arrests and even fewer charges, I think you have to look at the proportionality, which is what I think the new Commissioner and the Met Police did with distinction on a regular basis, just as they did when they were dealing with organised violence, racist violence over the summer. And that is why the authors of this report and other right-wing commentators are wrong to suggest we have two-tier policing in this country. As Mr. Twist said, we have many tiers. No, but it's suggested in the report, all of which I have read this morning, Nick. We do not have two-tier policing. What we have are the police doing their best to respond to what is in front of them week on week.
But do you need to view a swastika in context, Shami?
No, I perfectly agree that a swastika at a demonstration it was clearly intimidatory and unacceptable. But when you're talking about public order policing, as opposed to other types of policing, you have to think about whether to arrest in the moment or whether it would be safer for the police and for other members of the public to arrest afterwards, because you don't want to start a riot or to risk your officers necessarily in the moment.
Let me ask you both the same final question, if I may. I don't need to remind you, we live in very toxic times. There are demonstrations that happen, well, on a regular basis in regard to incidents and sadly other riots. What do you think, start with you if I can, David Spencer, what do you think needs to be learnt from the police response to how they've policed these demos to date?
Well, first of all, it's not just the police. There needs to be a root and branch review of the legal regime, which is hugely confused. And I certainly think that as the new government have an opportunity here to get the legislation right around protest. If they don't, they will unfortunately find themselves in the same mire than their predecessors did. In terms of policing, well, I think we would like to see, as Assistant Commissioner Twist has indicated he's going to, is to see more rapid intervention so that we can see the rule of law upholded on the streets of London.
David Spencer, thank you. Shami Chakrabarti, what would you hope is taken away from this?
There's certainly been a hell of a lot of legislation in recent years, and that doesn't help in terms of clarity and transparency. That you can see from all the text boxes that have been copied and pasted into this report. But I do think that those who claim that they are neutral investigators ought to declare their financial interests, and that includes the policy exchange, who I believe to be funded by people like oil companies.
All right, OK, well, David Spencer's not here to defend that, but I'm grateful. Shami Chakrabarti, thank you. Labour peer fodder, former Shadow Attorney General, Director of Liberty, and David Spencer was DCI in the Metropolitan Police and is Head of Crime and Justice.